I wasn't in a good place that August, and that's the plain truth of it. I was 42, good with motors, pressure switches, foot valves, and rusted fittings that had no business coming loose, and I trusted pump gauges more than I trusted most people. My name is Wade Caldwell, and for 20 years I made my living crawling into crawl spaces and pump houses all over 3 counties, bringing dead water systems back to life for folks who needed a shower before work and stock tanks full before noon. I knew what made a well fail. I knew what drought did to shallow veins. I knew the sound a tired pump made right before it gave up. What I didn't know, or couldn't admit, was what to do with a house that still felt like my father had stepped out of it 5 minutes ago, even though he'd been gone a year. I had stayed away from the Ridge place after the funeral, told myself I was too busy, told myself the route was out of the way, which was a lie because every route is out of the way when you don't want to arrive. The harder truth was that every board on that place knew my name in his voice, and I didn't have the strength for it. By the second week of August, when pasture all over the county had gone the color of old rope, and dust rose behind every truck like smoke, the call came from my own line. No pressure at the house, cattle troughs dropping, well sputtering air. I could have sent one of the younger guys from the shop, but that felt like hiring a stranger to answer a question I'd been dodging for 12 months. So I loaded my service truck and drove up the ridge. The place looked smaller than I remembered, and more tired than I was ready to see. Fence wire sagged in the lower lot. My father's wind vane, shaped like a trout, squealed every time the breeze shifted. The garden patch he'd kept straight as a ruler had gone ragged around the edges, though the tomatoes were hanging on out of pure stubbornness. I parked by the pump house, set my gauges on the concrete lid, and did what I always did first. Shut off power, cracked unions, checked prime, listened to the line breathe. The well had dropped below intake. The pump pulled, coughed, and spun dry. It was one more mechanical fact in a month full of them. It still landed like a verdict. At dusk, I hand-primed that dead pump until my forearms trembled. I poured water into the housing, worked the lever, waited for the catch, listened for the little rise in tone that means maybe, maybe, maybe. It would lift for a second, then lose its throat and fade into a useless whine. Heat sat on the ridge even after sunset, thick and dirty, and gnats circled my headlamp beam like metal filings. I muttered numbers to myself, depth estimates, recharge rates, static level guesses, as if arithmetic could bully groundwater back up from stone. It couldn't. I leaned against the siding and watched the pressure gauge needle sleep at 0. I had fixed stranger things for strangers. I couldn't fix this one for my own name. I ate canned beans on the porch because that was what was in the cupboard, and because cooking for one feels like pretending after a while. Gus sat by my boot, old blue heeler, one white mask over his right eye like he'd been painted in a hurry. He was my shadow on service calls, too deaf now to ride in town all day, but still sharp enough to read weather and people better than I could. I tipped half the beans into a second bowl and set it down. We listened to cicadas run their evening racket from the oak line, steady and electric. Then, all at once, they went quiet. Not tapering off, just gone. I looked up from the tin and listened hard, waiting for them to start back up. They didn't. Gus lifted his head, ears tipped forward, then settled again without a sound. After a minute, the noise returned in patches farther down slope, like somebody had turned sections of the world back on one by one. I slept light and wrong in my old room, woke before dawn with my shirt stuck to my back, and pulled on boots in the dark. The digital clock on the microwave said 4:41. I took a flashlight and walked the fence line to the stock tanks with Gus trotting ahead, nails clicking on the concrete pad and then going silent in the dirt. The trough nearest the barn was down to mud and 2 inches of cloudy water. The upper trough was dry enough for cracked rings to show where water had stood in better summers. Gus drank from my bottle when I tipped it, then sneezed dust and bumped my knee like he was apologizing for needing it. I scratched the patch behind his shoulder where his fur had gone silver and said, "We'll get it running." I said it to him. I said it to me. I said it because there was nobody else there. I spent that day doing every practical thing on the list. I pulled line, checked couplers, inspected for leaks, cleaned contacts, reset breakers, and dragged my sounding tape until the metal weight clicked far lower than I wanted to hear. I called 2 old drillers I trust and asked if they'd seen levels this bad on ridge wells. One said yes and offered sympathy he tried to disguise as weather talk. The other told me everybody was hurting and maybe I ought to truck water for a week. Both were right. Neither answer touched the knot in my chest. Around noon, my phone lit up with Eli's name and then went dark before I could answer. A pocket dial, maybe. Or maybe he changed his mind. I stared at that missed call longer than I'm proud of. I typed, "You good?" and deleted it. Then typed, "At the Ridge Place if you need me." Deleted that too. Pride is a dry thing. It makes its own weather. Eli was 22 and smarter than I was at 22, which might have been part of our problem. He'd left for a welding job 2 towns over and done well for himself. Steady checks, decent apartment, better truck than mine if we're being honest. We used to talk most evenings, short calls about bearings, brakes, and whatever needed doing. Then came the months after my father died, and every call turned into a careful walk through old arguments we never finished. He said I measured love in repairs. I said he mistook distance for independence. He said, "You don't listen unless something's broken." I said something sharp back that I replayed for weeks and won't repeat. There hadn't been a real conversation since spring. We sent each other weather and one-line updates like men passing tools through a doorway without making eye contact. By sunset the second day, heat lightning flashed way out beyond the western hills and never came close enough to help. I ate on the porch again, beans again, because apparently I had become that man. Gus lay with his chin on my boot and snored through his nose in small whistles. I watched shadows climb the tree trunks and thought about my father's hands, broad and scarred, laying out pipe lengths on this same porch and saying, "Water teaches humility if you pay attention." Back then I thought he meant hydraulics. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I wasn't in the mood for wisdom either way. I was tired, sunburned at the neck, and mad at everyone with nobody around to take it out on. Dark came heavy. The ridge lost its edges. House lights from the valley blinked on one by one, tiny yellow squares floating in dust haze. I took my flashlight and walked out to the well ring because sitting still inside felt worse than moving. The concrete was still warm from the day. I sat down on it and rested my elbows on my knees and listened to the quiet settle around me. No trucks, no wind in the higher firs. Just Gus pacing once around me and then lying down with a sigh, facing the tree line like he was on shift. I remember rubbing the heel of my hand against my chest, the way you do when there's no injury and it still hurts. I said it out loud because the dark will take honesty from you when daylight won't. I don't believe in things I can't fix with a wrench, I told nobody in particular. Never have. My voice sounded thin in open air. I tried again, softer. And I don't know how to fix this. I meant the well, sure. I also meant the house that held more memory than sleep, the silence between me and my son. The way grief had gone hard and practical inside me until it looked like work ethic from the outside. I sat there a long while with my palms on the concrete lip, feeling stored heat leak away into night. And for the first time since my father was buried, I let myself admit I was tired of carrying it alone. Sometime near midnight, the ridge went still again. Cicadas off, even the vane silent. Gus rose, moved to the yard's edge, and held there, tail low, gently wagging at the tree line. My light swept the well cap and caught a neat little offering beside it. 3 river stones crossed, a stem of yarrow, and damp black moss that didn't belong up here. I stared, then snorted and whispered a thank you to a pile of rocks. Gus leaned his shoulder against my shin and stayed there, steady and quiet, while I watched the dark trees and waited for morning. I kept waiting right there, hand resting on Gus's back, like if I moved too soon I'd break whatever fragile thing had settled over the yard. The flashlight beam shook a little because my hand shook a little, and I told myself that came from fatigue and too much coffee and not from being unsettled by flowers and stones arranged like somebody had meant to be understood. The yarrow was fresh, not wilted, not dusty, stems still cool. The moss was the part that held me. It sat dark and wet against the concrete cap, almost black in my light, and when I touched it, my fingertips came away damp in a month, when nothing stayed damp for long, unless it came from shade or underground. I looked toward the tree line and saw only trunks and layered dark. Gus didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't do any of the things he'd done at Coyotes for 13 years. He stood with that low, easy wag, then came back and sat beside me again like his shift had changed from guard dog to company. That got to me more than I wanted to admit. Dogs don't argue a theory. They don't debate likelihood. They either trust what's near or they don't. Mine trusted whatever had been here, and he trusted it enough to leave his post and lean into my leg. "I don't know what this is, bud," I said to him, quiet enough that the words barely felt real. "But if this is somebody's joke, it's a strange one." He blinked up at me and sneezed once like a man dismissing bad advice, then dropped his chin on my boot. I sat there until the concrete cooled under me and the night breeze finally came off the higher ridge, carrying dry pine, dirt, and that faint mineral smell wells get when you open old casing. It should have calmed me. Instead, it laid me open. In daylight, I can hide inside tasks. Check pressure, isolate line, pull pump, solve problem. At midnight, on my father's well ring with a dog and a pile of crossed stones for company, there was nothing left to hide behind. I remember thinking, I am so tired of pretending competence is the same thing as being okay. I had worn competence like armor since the funeral, and it fit me well enough that most folks stopped asking. Keep working, keep invoices straight, keep the truck running, keep your mouth shut. Don't start anything you can't finish. That code had paid bills and kept me useful. It had also turned my heart into a locked shop with the lights off. Sitting there, I admitted it plain. I missed my father in ways that made me angry at him for dying, and I missed my son in ways that made me angry at myself for still not dialing his number. I had water problems, yes, but deeper than that. I had become a man who could rebuild a pump blindfolded and still couldn't say, "I'm sorry," to his own boy. Somewhere past 1 in the morning, an owl called from the drawer below, low and even, and then the cicadas stitched themselves back together in the brush. The ordinary sounds returned, but they stayed softer than usual, as if the ridge had decided to speak in a lower voice. I picked up the stones one by one, just enough to feel their weight. River smoothed, not from this hillside. Whoever set them there had carried them. I set them back exactly as I found them. Then I did a thing I'd laugh at in any other man's story. I adjusted the yarrow stem so it wouldn't roll off the cap, like I was tidying up a gift table at church supper. By the time a pale seam of light found the eastern slope, my back ached and my eyes felt full of grit. I hadn't slept, but I didn't feel wired either. I felt emptied out in a cleaner way, as if sitting still all night had scraped some hard layer off me. Gus stood, stretched, and walked to the trees again. Not stiff, not hesitant, just attentive. He watched for maybe 20 seconds, tail giving that same slow swing, then turned and came to me when I whistled. That was when I noticed prints in the dust by the ring. Not clear yet, more like broad pressure marks where the dirt had compressed and cracked. Too wide for my boots by a long margin. I crouched, measured against my hand, and frowned. At first light, I went through the motions of mourning because chores don't wait for a man's existential crisis. I topped off Gus's bowl from the last jugs in the pantry, checked the dry troughs again, and watched the cattle nose the tank with that patient, accusing look stock has when you've failed a basic promise. By the third week of August, every rancher in the county had adopted the same stooped walk from hauling what water they could. I hauled mine in buckets from reserve barrels at the shed, enough to buy another day, maybe two. The sun was fully up by then, already hard and white, and the ridge carried heat like stored iron. After feeding, I went back to the well with a tape measure, notebook, and the kind of skeptical determination that had gotten me through 20 years of strange service calls. If there were tracks, I'd map them. If there were signs of human boots, I'd find them. If some neighbor kid was messing with me, I'd catch evidence before breakfast. I started at the ring and worked outward in a careful circle. What I found made less sense the farther I went. Broad heel-to-toe impressions, deep at the rear, lighter at the front, each one set with deliberate spacing. Not random stomping, not drunken wandering. A path. It curved around my pepper plants by a clean 6 inches and crossed open ground where the dirt was crusted hardest. No toe ridges from fake feet, no drag marks from boards, no ATV tracks. Whoever or whatever had moved here had moved heavy and careful at the same time. I stood up and laughed once, short and dry, because my options were narrowing in a way I didn't enjoy. "Well done, Wade," I said to nobody. "You have arrived at the stage of life where you inspect mystery footprints before coffee." It came out bitter and a little funny, and it eased me for half a minute. Gus didn't share the joke. He had walked ahead to the lower edge of the yard and was staring past the fence. Ears tipped, body loose, tail making that same quiet metronome swing. Then a mule deer stepped from the brush 30 yards downhill. A young doe with summer red coat and one torn ear notch, and she did not bolt. She looked toward the trees, lowered her head, and fed on dry bunch grass like it was an ordinary morning. Gus watched her and sat down. I watched both of them, and the hair on my forearms lifted without any spike of fear attached to it. It felt like standing outside a room where a conversation is happening in low voices, and knowing you're not invited, but not unwelcome either. I spent the hottest part of the day repairing what I could and pretending that was enough. I cleaned sediment from the foot valve, checked wiring again, recalibrated pressure switch tolerances I already knew were not the true problem, and did every practical thing twice to avoid doing the one impractical thing, which was admit I was waiting for night. Around noon, I almost called Eli 3 separate times. Each time I opened his contact, stared at his name, then set the phone face down on the workbench. Pride kept winning by points, not knockouts. That somehow felt worse. Late afternoon rolled in with that amber light drought country gets when dust hangs in the distance and the sun starts to soften without cooling anything. I carried split wood from the side stack to the porch and stopped halfway because there was more wood on the rack than there had been at breakfast. I knew every stick I had split this month. These were fresh cut, bark still bright on the edges, stacked tighter than I stack when I'm in a hurry. 4 neat rows, all heartwood side out, no waste pieces tossed on top. I set my armload down and counted twice, then walked to the chopping block to check for chips. None. The maul leaned where I'd left it. No new splinter scatter in the dirt. I turned a slow circle in the yard. Trees, fence, pump house, empty road. No engine noise, no human voices, no sign of pranksters congratulating themselves. Gus padded over, sniffed the new stack, and sat beside it, calm as Sunday. He looked at me, then at the trees, then back at me with that old dog expression that always seemed one step from speaking plain English. I scratched under his collar and said, "If you start giving me advice, I'm selling the truck and taking up beekeeping." He thumped his tail once against the porch step, tolerant of my nonsense. Evening settled slow. The ridge held heat until almost dark, then finally exhaled. I ate cold biscuits and a tomato at the porch rail and kept glancing toward the well ring without meaning to. The crossed stones were still there where I'd put them back. The yarrow had drooped a little, but not much. Just after sunset, when the light went copper through the firs, I heard movement from the creek side and took my lantern down the path, more curious than cautious. Near the bend where the old alder roots crossed the bank, I found a snare loop hanging open on a stake I hadn't set and didn't recognize. The wire had been twisted apart, not cut, each turn peeled back clean. A fawn stood 10 yards away with its dam, both of them still as carved wood, then drifted into brush at an easy walk. No panic, no crashing retreat. I crouched and picked up the loosened wire. The twists were tight, deliberate, stronger than my grip. I carried it back and set it on the porch table because evidence mattered to me, even when I didn't know what evidence was proving. Then I returned to the well and sat on the ring again as dark climbed out of the hollows. I didn't turn on the porch light. I wanted the yard as it was, plain and true. The stillness came earlier that night. Not empty, not dead, just concentrated. Cicadas hushed in a widening circle, and even the wind vane stopped its thin squeal. Gus moved to the same edge of the yard and stood with that low wag, eyes fixed on the pines. I followed his gaze and saw nothing at first. Then I heard it. One heavy thud of earth, then another, spaced like someone working with patience. Thud. Pause. Thud. No scramble, no rush, no crash through brush. Labor sounds. Steady and measured, coming from near the wellhead and then just beyond it. Every practical part of me wanted to flood the yard with light, grab the wrench from the porch rail, and force certainty onto whatever this was. I didn't. I stayed seated with both hands on the concrete lip, breath shallow, heart hammering, and watched the dark take shape by inches. Gus did not bark once. He sat down and leaned against my knee, warm and solid, and we listened together while something large worked in the night, as if my survival were a task worth finishing. We listened together while something large worked in the night, as if my survival were a task worth finishing. And after the first minute of fear passed, another feeling moved in beside it, quieter and harder to explain. I wanted to know what it was doing. That surprised me most. I had expected panic or denial or the kind of stubborn anger that had carried me through plenty of bad calls. But curiosity sat down in my chest like it had every right to be there. The thuds kept coming, measured and unhurried, with the faint scrape of displaced soil between them. I could map the rhythm without seeing the hands behind it. 3 strikes, a pause, a shift in footing, then 3 more. Work cadence, familiar as breathing. I stayed on the ring until my legs cramped. At one point I stood, lifted the lantern from the porch hook and took 6 steps toward the wellhead. The sounds stopped at once. Not a crash away, not brush snapping downhill. Just silence laid carefully over the yard. Gus rose with me, watched the trees, then glanced back as if to ask whether this was wise. I waited, hearing my own pulse in my ears, and when nothing resumed, I set the lantern down on the ground and stepped back to where I'd been sitting. The moment I settled, the labour started again from a little farther out, heavy and patient, like whoever worked out there had accepted my boundary and asked me to accept his. Around 2 in the morning, thin clouds drifted over the stars, and the dark got softer at the edges. I could make out the shape of the pump house and the fence posts without my light. I remember thinking in present tense, clear as if I were saying it into a recorder. I am not asleep. I am not dreaming. And I am not being hunted. I am sitting on my father's well ring listening to something bigger than any man I know move dirt in careful strokes. I am afraid and calm at the same time, which ought to be impossible but isn't. I want to run the floodlights and prove this wrong. I want to stay still and let it finish. I don't understand why that second want is winning. I don't understand why Gus is leaning against me instead of guarding me. I don't understand what kind of world lets this happen, but I am in it either way. By the time the eastern sky lightened, the thuds had faded into the ordinary morning sounds of a ridge waking up thirsty. Cicadas started in bursts. A jay complained from the fur line. The trout vein found enough breeze to squeal once and settle. I stood slow, joints stiff, and walked to the well with Gus close at my heel. Fresh earth ringed the cap in a broad crescent, darker than the surrounding dust, as if turned from below the baked surface. Flat stones I hadn't placed sat in 2 neat piles, one to either side of the opening, sorted by size like a mason had laid them out for easy reach. The crossed river stones were still where I'd left them, untouched. Whoever had worked all night hadn't kicked them aside or crushed the yarrow. That little stem, drooped and stubborn, stood there like a flag. I knelt and ran my fingers through the loosened dirt. Cool underneath. Fine grains mixed with small chips of hardpan and a faint mineral damp that didn't belong in August. The well itself was still below intake when I sounded it, and the gauge still mocked me at 0, but the ground told a different story. Something had begun. I measured 3 of the prints that crossed the yard and circled the ring, heel to toe and then width at the broadest point, writing numbers in my notebook with hands that refused to steady. 22 inches on one stride, 23 on another. Width over 8. Depth varied with footing, deepest where the soil crust broke near the cottonwood roots. The tracks arced around my pepper bed again with absurd precision, missing the nearest plant by less than a handspan. I stood up and looked toward the tree line, then caught myself doing it and laughed under my breath. I spend my life telling folks to trust measurements, I said to Gus. Now, I'm over here taking field notes on the world's largest barefoot landscaper. He yawned big enough to show every tooth he had left, then walked to the well and sniffed the stone piles like an inspector checking workmanship. That afternoon brought heat that flattened thought. I moved through chores with the notebook in my back pocket and the sense that I was waiting for an appointment I hadn't scheduled. 3 days had passed since I first found the crossed stones, and my grief had not gone anywhere, but it had shifted off-center just enough to let other things in. I noticed details again. The way shade slid under the porch rail by inches. The exact point in the day when the firs began to smell like sap instead of dust. The soft clink of tank chain against dry concrete. Curiosity did not heal me. It gave me breathing room. Near noon, I drove down to Larkin's place for 2 bales and a roll of wire I didn't strictly need, mostly because talking to another human felt like maintenance. Mr. Larkin met me by his barn in a sweat-darkened hat, mustache full of hay chaff, eyes creased from squinting into weather for 70 years. He looked in the truck bed, then at me. "You look like you've been up with a sick child," he said. "More like up with a stubborn well." He gave a tired half smile. "That ridge eaten you alive?" "Trying." I hesitated, then added, "Somebody's been on the place nights. Helping, I think. Doesn't look like theft." He hitched his thumbs in his belt. "Well, whoever helped, they saved your stock from what I hear. You keep getting water up there, and I don't care if it's elves with shovels." I watched a fly circle the salt block and answered before I could edit it. "I know what I saw, and I know what I didn't feel." He studied me a second longer, not mocking, not pressing. "Then pay attention to that second part," he said. "Most men don't." I loaded the wire, drove home slow, and kept hearing that line over the engine noise. Most men don't. I had spent a year not paying attention to what I felt if I couldn't repair it. Maybe that rule had expired. By late day, the heat finally loosened. Dust in the valley turned the light honey-coloured, and the white pines on the north edge caught a glow along one side of their trunks. I checked troughs, topped what I could, and set a lantern on the porch rail out of habit. Then I took my pipe wrench from the pump house and carried it with me to the well, not because I intended to swing it, but because old instincts die hard. Metal in hand had always meant I could do something. Gus trotted ahead, stopped halfway across the yard, and looked toward the pines with ears forward and tail giving that low, easy wag I had started to recognize as a signal, not alarm but acknowledgement. I followed his gaze and saw movement where shadow met light, maybe 30 yards off. At first it looked like a trunk shifting in wind, except there was no wind and trunks don't step sideways. The shape detached itself from the trees, slowly enough that my eyes had time to adjust. Dark fur catching amber at the edges, shoulders as wide as a gate panel, head level with a low branch I knew sat above my reach by more than 3 feet. 8, maybe 9 feet by comparison to the pine behind him. Too large for any explanation I had left. He carried 2 rounded stones cupped in one hand. Not clenched, held. I stopped where I was. The wrench hung from my fingers, suddenly ridiculous, like a toy I had brought to a church service. The figure stopped too, body angled quarter turn rather than square to me. 1 foot slightly behind the other, as if making room in a narrow hallway. No chest thumping, no charge, no display. Just stillness and attention. I could see his face in pieces through the backlit branches, brow heavy, nose broad, eyes set deep, and catching the same amber the pines held. Calm eyes. That was the first complete thought that cut through the shock. Calm. He bent at the knees and set the stones down near the wellhead with a precision that would have impressed any stoneworker I know. Set, not dropped. He adjusted one with 2 fingers, nudging it until it sat flush against the other, then lifted his hand away and looked at me again. The contrast hit me hard enough to make my throat close. Massive frame, deliberate gentleness, power under full control. Gus walked 3 steps toward him and sat. That was it. No bark, no bristle. Just sat down in open view. Old dog posture, straight and easy. A mule deer, maybe the same doe from morning, stepped from brush 20 yards downslope and fed with her head. Low, tail still. The whole hillside held that strange, cooperative quiet I had felt for nights, and standing inside it felt less like trespassing than being tolerated in somebody else's good order. My knees wanted to lock. My hands wanted to shake. Instead, I heard myself speak into the space between us, voice rough and small. "Evening." The figure didn't answer, of course. He lowered his gaze for a beat, then lifted it back, never breaking the sideways stance. I eased the wrench down and set it on the concrete ring where he could see the motion start to finish. He watched, then shifted one step backward toward the pines, slow enough to read as courtesy, not retreat. The resulting tension in me cracked open into something close to gratitude and not far from grief. I had spent so long bracing against harm that I barely recognized kindness when it arrived at this scale. I stood there while the sun slid lower and turned every dust mote gold. He moved once more, taking another stone from the grass and placing it beside the pair, building a shallow arc along the well's edge, each piece chosen for shape and fit. When he finished, he rested his hand lightly on the top stone as if checking stability, then drew back and let the silence settle. We stayed like that for several breaths, two creatures at different sizes and maybe different kinds, neither crowding the other. Then he turned toward the pines. No hurry, no drama. 3 long steps and he was partly hidden, 4 and he was shadow, 5 and he was gone except for the slight sway of fern fronds at knee height and the memory of those calm eyes holding mine without malice. Gus remained seated another moment, then got up and came back to press against my leg. I didn't move right away. The stone arc by the wellhead looked intentional, almost instructional, and the ground beside it showed fresh scuffs where work would continue after dark. By the last light of that evening, with my wrench resting useless on the concrete and my old dog breathing steady at my side, curiosity had become trust enough for me to stay and see what happened next. I stayed where I was, one hand on Gus's collar, and watched the last amber light thin down to grey between the fir trunks. The stone arc near the wellhead held its shape in the dim, 3 rounded pieces set with more intention than most people use on a fence corner. My wrench lay across the concrete ring, dull metal catching the sky's final colour, and I left it there on purpose, out in plain view, like a statement I wasn't ready to say out loud yet. Gus sat, then stood, then sat again, eyes fixed on the same corridor of trees where the figure had vanished. He was alert, but easy. That mattered more than anything I could have measured. As dusk settled fully, I moved to the porch without turning on the yard light. I lit the lantern low and set it on the top step so it threw a soft circle instead of a spotlight. The house behind me creaked as it cooled, that old timber ticking I used to hear as a kid when my father stayed up late doing books at the kitchen table. I poured water from a jug into a tin cup, took a sip that tasted warm and flat, and kept my eyes on the well. I wasn't setting a trap. I wasn't pretending this was normal either. I was making room. An hour into dark, the ridge slipped into that concentrated quiet I had learned to recognize. Not empty, not dead, just attentive. Cicadas went silent near the yard first, then farther downslope in staggered pockets. Gus rose and walked to the edge of the grass, tail low, gently swinging. I heard one soft thud in the dirt near the well, then another, each spaced by a breath-long pause. A scrape followed, then a heavier set, the same work cadence as the night before, only closer now, close enough that I could hear soil shifting against stone. I stepped off the porch and stopped beside the ring. "I'm here," I said, voice low, not to challenge, just to announce. "I won't crowd you." The thuds paused. 2 heartbeats, 3. Then they resumed, slower than before, as if to answer in kind. I backed up 6 steps and sat on the bottom stair, elbows on my knees. From there I could make out a broad shape moving in and out of the dark by the wellhead, bigger than any man, shoulders rising and lowering with deliberate control. He was using my shovel. I realized that, in fragments, the shaft angle, the faint catch of worn tape wrapped below the grip where it had split last spring, the rhythm of lift and set. He drove the blade into hardpan, levered up compacted earth, and laid it aside in a growing fan without scattering my stones or crushing the yarrow stem. Every motion looked considered. He never rushed. He never glanced around like he expected to be attacked. He worked like a neighbor fixing a gate in silence because words would only get in the way. I sat there with my pulse thudding in my throat and thought in present tense because my mind had run out of safer frames. I am watching this happen. I am not misreading shadow. I am not inventing comfort because I am lonely. I know what a prank looks like, and this is not that. I know what aggression looks like, and this is not that either. He could close this distance in a second if harm were the point, and harm is clearly not the point. The point is the well. The point is water. The point is that my old dog has chosen the yard's edge, not my hiding place, and he is standing there like he trusts the hands doing this work. I wanted my world to be simpler than this, and it wasn't. By the time the moon rose over the lower ridge, a pale slice caught in haze, the figure changed tasks. He set the shovel down carefully against the ring, then lifted one of the flat stones from the sorted piles and lowered himself to a kneel. Even kneeling, he stood taller than my porch rail. He leaned over the opening and reached in with both hands, placing stone against cut earth somewhere below the lip. He adjusted, pressed, checked, reached for another, set, pressed, checked. Mason's work, patient and exact. The scrape of rock against rock carried clean through the yard. Not once did he slam or force anything. He built by fit. 3 days had passed since the first crossed stones appeared, and that line in my life felt wider than the date should have allowed. I had come up here to diagnose a mechanical failure and leave. Now I was sitting in the dark, while something out of every story I'd ever dismissed was lining my father's well by hand and doing it better than most crews could under contract. Near midnight, I stood and carried another jug from the kitchen to the porch rail, then froze halfway down the steps, feeling ridiculous about hydration etiquette with an 8-foot stranger. I set the jug on the bottom step and nudged it toward open ground with my boot. "For me," I said softly, because that was true. And then, after a breath, "You can have it if you want." He did not approach it. He glanced once, then returned to the well. Boundary held, respect answered by respect. I might have laughed if I wasn't so full up already. I had reached the stage of adulthood where I was sharing porch space and labor rights with a giant and trying to keep social manners intact. The absurd part did not cancel the sacred part. It made it human enough to bear. Clouds moved across the moon and the light flattened. In that softer dark, his outline seemed less like a shock and more like a fact I had not previously accounted for. Gus eventually left the tree line and settled beside my boot, pressing his shoulder into me with old, familiar weight. Every so often he lifted his head toward the well, watched, then rested again. The deer came back too, just beyond the fence, feeding with slow sidesteps through dry grass. No bolting, no alarm snorts. Whatever language passed among animals and silence, it kept saying the same thing: stay easy. Past 2 in the morning, the work changed in tone. The thud of digging gave way to shorter impacts and a hollow knock from deeper down, as if stone was seating against stone in a narrower shaft. I walked to the ring, this time close enough to see his hands clearly when he rose from the opening. Massive palms, fingers thick as fence posts at the base, nails dark and blunt, movements fine-tuned enough to brush dirt from the lip without chipping it. He turned his body halfway aside when he saw me, giving me lane space like he had at first sight. That small courtesy undid me more than the size ever had. "I know," I said, hearing my own voice roughen. "I see you." He held still for a long moment. Calm eyes found mine, amber brown even in weak moonlight. No demand in them, no fear, just attention, steady and ancient and oddly gentle. Then he dipped his head once, not quite a nod, more like acknowledgement, and reached for another stone. I backed away again and stayed put. There was nothing for me to improve. That landed hard in a life built on fixing. My job now was witness. By the time a pale seam showed in the east, the ridge air had cooled enough to smell wet earth around the well ring. Wet in August. The scent rose mineral and clean, threaded with clay and old groundwater, and my chest tightened so fast I had to brace a hand on the porch post. He was still at the far side of the clearing, kneeling, one shoulder lit by the first weak light. He set a final flat rock into the collar just below the lip and pressed it with 2 fingers until it locked. Then he smoothed loose grit away from the edge, stood in one controlled lift, and stepped back. Only then did I see my shovel planted upright beside the ring, blade cleaned, handle straight, placed where I could grab it first thing. I had knocked it into the ravine brush 2 days earlier and never found time to retrieve it. He had gone and gotten it. That detail, small compared to the well itself, carried a level of care I couldn't argue with. He moved to the clearing's edge and stopped, shoulders angled away, head lowered slightly. The posture read plain as daylight. "This is yours." I crossed the yard on legs that felt borrowed. Fresh-cut earth rimmed the opening in a neat circle, and the interior wall sat 3 feet deeper than it had at sundown, lined in hand-set stone, tight enough that I could barely slide my fingertips between seams. No cave-in crumble, no rushed mess, just sound work. Old country spring work, the kind my father used to praise when he came across it on service calls. Built by somebody who respected water, he'd say. I grabbed the rope bucket from the pump house, looped it, and lowered it into the shaft. The rope slid against the new collar with a dry whisper, then a damp hiss, then silence. I kept feeding line, eyes fixed on the dark circle below, heart beating so hard I could feel it in my teeth. For one suspended second, I worried it would strike dust again and prove I'd stepped fully outside my senses. Then came the sound. Soft, clean, unmistakable. Splash. I shut my eyes and held the rope with both hands like it was a live wire. When I pulled, the weight came up steady and true. Cold drops hit my wrist before the bucket cleared the lip. Clear water, dark silver in dawn light, trembling at the rim. I set it down and touched it just to be sure, then lifted both hands to my face and let that cold, run-over skin gone hot with relief. My knees gave and I sat in the dirt and cried hard, shoulders shaking, laughing once through it, because there was water in my father's well again. "Dad," I said out loud, voice breaking, first words to him since the funeral, "it's running. I couldn't do it, but it's running." I wiped my face with my sleeve and said, "I'm calling Eli this morning. No more waiting." He turned without ceremony and walked into the firs until the grey took him. Bent grass marked his line, deep heel-to-toe prints held in damp soil, and the repaired stone collar under my hand sat solid and real. I stayed kneeling beside that ring until my breathing eased enough to stop hitching. Gus came over slow, pressed his muzzle under my elbow, and licked the salt off my wrist where tears and well water had mixed. I cupped water in both hands and let him drink from my palms like he had when he was a pup. He drank, sneezed, then leaned his shoulder into my chest hard enough to steady me. The dawn air smelled like wet clay and fir pitch and turned earth, and that scent alone nearly broke me again. I had spent a year treating grief like a leak you isolate and ignore until there's time for proper repair. Standing there with cold water beading on my knuckles and a stone collar that had not existed yesterday, I could not maintain that lie another minute. "I miss you," I said to the well, to my father, to the empty place where his truck used to sit. "I miss you, and I've been mad about it. Mad at everybody because you're gone. My voice came rough, like I hadn't used it in months. And I have been wrong with Eli. I know it. I know it. The words went out into open morning and did not come back to bite me. They just landed. As dawn widened over the ridge, I sat on the concrete ring and let myself feel the full weight of what had happened instead of reducing it to mechanics. I told myself this couldn't be real, then touched the damp stone seam and felt grit under my thumb. I told myself I was exhausted, overheated, half out of my head, then lowered the bucket again and heard that clean splash answer from below. I told myself there had to be a human explanation, a crew, a prank, a hidden machine, and every practical thought failed against the same plain facts. No tire tracks, no tool scatter, no damage, no boast, no demand. Only work done with care, and then surrendered back to me. I had wanted the world to stay narrow because narrow feels controllable. That morning it widened anyway. I stood, wiped my face on my sleeve, and made myself do the first practical steps, because practical was still my native language. I took pictures with my phone, the fresh depth mark on the inside wall, the handset flats, the upright shovel, the arcs of deep prints in damp earth, the untouched crossed stones and drooped yarrow by the cap. I measured the new collar height against my tape and wrote it in the notebook with the same hand I used for service logs. Then I capped a mason jar from the kitchen with the first drawer, clear and cold, and set it on the porch table beside the twisted snare wire. Evidence mattered, not for fame, not for argument, just because I needed the record to match the memory. Then I went inside, set my phone on the counter, and stared at Eli's name until my thumb stopped hovering. I called before. Courage cooled. It rang 4 times. 5. On 6 he picked up, voice sleep-thick and guarded. "Dad?" "Yeah," I said, and had to clear my throat. "Yeah, it's me. I know it's early. I'm up at the Ridge place." A pause. "Everything okay?" I looked out the window at the well ring and the damp ground shining in first light. "It is now. Listen, I'm not calling to argue, I'm calling to say I'm sorry. For spring. For all of it. You said I only listen when something's broken, and you were right. I'm listening now. If you can come up this weekend, I'd like that. We can work fences, or not work fences. I just want to see you." He exhaled into the line, long and shaky, like he had been braced for impact and found none. "I can come Sunday," he said. "I wanted to call last week and didn't know where to start." "Start there," I said. "Sunday's good." We sat in silence for 3 breaths that felt like new ground settling underfoot. Then he asked, softer, "You sound different. You sick?" A laugh slipped out of me, uneven and honest. "No, just got reminded this morning that I don't run the whole universe." "That's so?" "Yeah," I said, looking at the stone collar again. "That's so." After we hung up, I stood at the sink with both hands on the counter and let relief move through me in waves. Not dramatic, just deep. The call had not fixed us. It had opened a door we both still had to walk through. That was enough. I splashed my face, filled the kettle with fresh well water out of habit I hadn't been able to use in days, and listened to the burner tick alive. The simple sound of water moving through a line into metal felt like mercy in mechanical form. I carried a mug to the porch and dialed Mr. Larkin next, because he had been plain with me and deserved the outcome. He answered on the second ring, already outside by the sound of wind across his receiver. "Mornin'." "Mornin'. It's Wade. You were right. Somebody helped. Well's drawing again." "Good," he said. No surprise in it, just satisfaction. "Told you your stock might get a break." I watched Gus lap from a pan I'd just filled. "I took measurements and photos. I know how this sounds." He gave a low chuckle. "Son, at my age most things sound strange till breakfast. Keep your notes. Water in August is what counts. I thanked him and ended the call. And for a moment I stood there grinning at nothing. A tired man in dusty boots grinning because he had apparently reached the chapter of life where he made dawn phone rounds to report that impossible masonry had occurred politely overnight. When I stepped off the porch again, the clearing had brightened enough to show every detail sharp. The shovel blade clean, the lip uncrumbled, the piles of spare flats sorted by size, and beyond them, the first line of trees, where shadow still held. At the far edge of that shadow, I caught movement. He was there, half screened by 2 fir trunks, shoulders turned away from the yard. Not hiding, not presenting, just pausing as if to make sure I had what I needed before he left the place to me. I did not walk toward him. I knew better now. I set my mug down on the well ring, placed my open hand over my chest like I would at a graveside, and said, quiet and clear, "Thank you." My voice carried across the short grass and damp soil, then thinned into the trees. He lifted his head a fraction. Sunlight touched one side of his face through needles and picked out that amber-brown eye for a heartbeat. Then he dipped his chin once, turned and moved uphill between the firs with the same measured economy he had used at the well. No crashing branches, no theatrical last look. Each step placed with intent, heel then forefoot, bending fern and huckleberry and letting them rise behind him. In 3 seconds he was mostly outline. In 6 he was a dark suggestion between trunks. In 10 he was gone, and only the path of pressed grass and deep prints remained to say he had been there at all. I stood listening to the forest take its regular sounds back. First a jay, then cicadas in scattered bands, then the trout vane finding breeze and giving one rusty squeal that made me laugh through fresh tears. The quiet that followed his leaving was not empty. It felt complete, like a job signed off without paperwork. Gus trotted to the tree line, sniffed the bent grass, and looked uphill a long moment. His tail swung once, twice, easy and low. Then he turned and came back to me on his own, no coaxing, and sat against my leg, facing the well. That simple choice settled something in me. Whatever bond had existed in those nights was not possession, not taming, not a storybook claim. It was recognition and then release. By full sunrise, heat had started to gather again on the exposed slope, but the drought no longer felt like a sentence carved in stone. I hauled bucket after bucket to the stock tank until water ran clear from the line and the cattle stepped in, drinking with that loud, grateful pull that ranchers know better than hymns. Between trips, I kept glancing toward the firs, not in panic, not expecting a return on command, just honoring the place where he had vanished. He did not reappear. He did not need to. Before breakfast, I completed one more task that mattered to me. I took the 3 crossed river stones in both hands, felt their smooth weight, and reset 2 of them exactly as they had been by the cap. The third I carried into the pump house and placed on the shelf above the pressure switch, where my eye would catch it every time I reached for a wrench. Not as a trophy, as a reminder. The yarrow stem I left where it stood until it finally browned in the sun. When I walked back out, the repaired well sat quiet in bright morning. Water just below the new collar, rope damp against stone. The tree line held still, patient and ordinary. Gus leaned against my boot, and I rested my hand on his neck and let the day begin. By noon that same day, I had pressure back at the kitchen sink and both stock tanks filling from the line instead of from my shoulders. The pump still sounded tired, but it held prime, and the gauge climbed steady past 30 and settled where it ought to. I stood in the pump house with one hand on the switch box and listened to the motor hum like a small hymn I'd forgotten I knew. On the shelf above it sat that single river stone, dark and smooth, beside a can of dielectric grease and a box of wire nuts. Ordinary and not ordinary at all. I carried the mason jar of first draw water to the counter, wrote the date on masking tape, and stuck the label on straight. Then I slipped the twisted snare wire into a coffee tin so it wouldn't get lost under bolts and nails. I wasn't building a museum. I was refusing to lie to myself later. That afternoon, I drove into town with two things on the seat beside me: the water jar and my notebook. Heat shimmered above the blacktop, and every pasture I passed looked like old straw mats laid flat to dry. At the feed store lot, Mr. Larkin leaned against his truck with a sack of mineral over one shoulder, waiting his turn at the dock. He gave me a look that landed halfway between concern and curiosity. "Well, Holden," he asked. I set the jar on my tailgate and nodded. "Holden, I brought a sample to the extension office anyway. Figure I should test what I'm drinking." He shifted the sack, then tipped his chin toward the trees beyond town. "Your daddy used to say that North Ridge had old water if you could find where it hid. Didn't say much else." That stopped me. "He ever tell you stories?" Larkin scratched his mustache and shook his head. "He told me to mind my stock and respect quiet work. That's what I know." At the extension office, a young tech named Aaron took the sample, filled out a form, and promised a basic panel by the next day. "You had a new dig done?" he asked, pen hovering. I could have invented a contractor name. I heard myself say, "Had some help overnight, stone line by hand." He looked up like he was waiting for a punchline, then, to his credit, only said, "Well, whoever did it understood groundwater. We'll call you." He did call the next afternoon while I was tightening a fence stretcher on the upper line. "Test came back clean," he said through static. "Minerals high but safe, no coliform." I wrote the numbers in my notebook beside the depth marks and thanked him. That thread mattered to me. Water was wonder, yes, but water was also health. Sunday arrived with a thin veil of cloud and just enough breeze to keep the flies honest. I heard Eli's truck before I saw it, engine note lower than mine, tires crunching the gravel slow like he was giving himself room to leave if the mood turned bad. He parked by the barn and stepped out in work jeans and a faded welding shirt, taller than I remembered from spring. Beard trimmed close, eyes carrying my same stubborn set. We stood 6 feet apart by the gate and both reached for words at once. He laughed first, short and nervous. "You look like you slept outside for a week." I answered, "You look like you started buying expensive coffee." He grinned despite himself. The tension loosened one notch. We walked to the north fence with post clips, pliers, and a bucket of staples. Work gave us a rhythm to stand inside while we figured out how to talk without armor. Halfway down the line he stopped, leaned on the pliers, and looked towards the well yard. "You said on the phone something reminded you don't run the universe." I pushed a staple home with the hammer and watched my own hand for a second. "Yeah." I set the hammer down. "I'm going to tell you what happened and you can believe me or not, but I'm done editing truth to sound acceptable." Then I told it plain. The crossed stones, the moss, the nights of digging, the full sight in the pines, the dawn splash. Every piece in order, same as a service report, because that was the most honest way I knew. Eli listened without interrupting, eyes narrowed against sun glare, face unreadable until the end. When I finished, he glanced down at Gus, lying in the shade of the fence roll, then back at me. "And you weren't scared?" he asked. "I was scared," I said. "I just wasn't in danger." He held that for a while, then nodded once. "I don't know what to do with that," he said. "You don't have to do anything with it," I answered. "Just know I'm not making it up." He tapped the pliers against his thigh, then gave me a look so much like my father's it nearly knocked the wind out of me. I believe that you believe it, and I believe Gus, he pointed. That dog has better judgment than both of us combined. By the second Sunday of September, he came again, and this time he brought breakfast burritos, and didn't wait in the truck before getting out. We replaced 2 rotten braces at the lower pasture and took water breaks on the well ring between tasks. The yarrow stem had gone brown and papery by then, still upright where I'd left it. Eli touched one of the 2 crossed stones with his boot toe and said, "You keeping these here?" I nodded. 2 stay, one's in the pump house. He sat beside me and rubbed dust off his forearm. Mom used to say grief makes men weird in opposite directions. Some get loud, some get useful. I gave a dry laugh. I got useful enough to be unbearable. He nudged my shoulder with his. You did, but you're better this month. We sat quiet, listening to water tick in the line and cedar waxwings fuss in the cottonwood. And for once, silence felt like rest, not distance. I did call the 2 old drillers back, one on a Wednesday evening while I was cleaning tools at the bench, and one the next morning before heading to a service job. I told each of them the same mechanical facts. 3 feet deeper through hardpan, stone collar, recharge recovered. The first whistled low and said, "Who'd you hire? I might steal him." The second went quiet long enough that I thought we'd dropped signal, then said, "Sometimes old seams reopen when pressure shifts." He left it there. I left it there too. I wasn't trying to win a debate. I needed my own ledger closed. The men I asked for help heard the outcome, and the outcome was life returning to the line. October brought one clean rain that darkened the ridge and made the well yard smell like iron and leaves. Eli came up with a spool of smooth wire, and we finished the east boundary in jackets instead of sweat-soaked shirts. During lunch at the tailgate, he looked at the print photos on my phone, pinching in on the deep heel marks beside my boot for scale. "You ever going to show these around?" he asked. I took the phone back and locked the screen. No. Why not? Because the well is fixed, the stock are watered, and I don't need strangers turning this place into a parking lot. He chewed that over, then nodded. Fair. After a minute, he added, "Also, half of town would call you crazy." I said, "Only half?" And he laughed hard enough to spill coffee. That laugh did more for my chest than any sermon I've heard. I never saw him again in full, not once, and that is part of the truth too. No dramatic return, no parade of signs on command. Some mornings there were broad prints near the upper spring, cut after rain, already softening at the edges by the time I reached them. Twice that winter I found split wood stacked by the porch before dawn, tighter than my stacks and drier than it should have been. I used every piece. I left no notes and no offerings beyond keeping the yard respectful and the gate clear. The snare wire stayed in the coffee tin until November, when Eli and I carried it to the county office and handed it over, with a short statement about illegal sets near the creek. The deputy took it, wrote a report number on a card, and later left me a voicemail saying they pulled 2 more wires downstream. Quiet outcome. Good enough. On a cold evening near Thanksgiving, Eli and I stood in the pump house while sleet tapped the tin roof, and the pressure gauge held steady. He picked up the Riverstone from the shelf, weighed it in his palm, and set it back exactly where it had been. "You know what's strange?" he said. "You're still you. You still label everything and argue with bad wiring and keep spare couplers in your coat pocket." I smiled. That's because bad wiring deserves argument. He looked at me, softer then. "But you're not shut down anymore." I leaned against the doorframe and watched Gus asleep in a coil of extension cord like he owned the place. "Yeah," I said. "I spent a long time thinking strength meant never needing anything. Turns out that was just fear in work boots. The last thing I'll tell you is simple. I remained practical. I still trusted gauges, test results, torque specs, and the plain mathematics of water moving through pipe. I still had no taste for attention, and I never told this story where it could be turned into spectacle. But each morning when I checked the pump, I touched that stone on the shelf and remembered a night when the world stepped outside my framework and met me with care. The drought had emptied the well and shown me the limits of what I could force. What answered in the trees did not ask for belief, payment, or credit. It gave help, kept distance, and left me my name. I carried that forward into every call with Eli, every fence line we rebuilt, every quiet supper on that porch with Gus, leaning warm against my boot and water running clear in the pipes. That was the change. Not that I stopped being skeptical, that I stopped mistaking skepticism for the whole of wisdom, and finally let kindness count as evidence too.